pour la poser. You also have the option to completely mute the speaker and only hear the interpretation. So for this, you should click on Mute Original Audio. And one last detail is that all the camera functions have been switched off, and will only activate these functions for speakers and for participants who wish to take the floor during the Q&A. So please feel free to indicate to us at any moment during the event that you will wish to speak during the last segment by giving your name, your login name, and your organization in the chat function. Today's program will run as follows. I will hand over in one moment to Ms. Sarah Charles, Assistant to the Administrator of USAID's Bureau for Humanitarian Assistance, who will be giving opening remarks to this event. We're very pleased to have Sarah here with us today. After Sarah's remarks, I'll present the key findings of this year's report, before then turning to our panel of speakers who will be discussing these findings and sharing their perspectives on the topic. And I will present all these speakers to you in a few moments. After the panel discussion, we'll turn to an approximately half-hour Q&A with the audience. We look forward to hearing all your feedback and to answering any questions that you may want to ask the panelists during this segment. You can, of course, use the chat or the QA function to submit your question in writing, as my team is on standby to collate all these questions during the event. And of course, we'll do our best to respond to as many questions as possible. Ms. Charles, if I may ask you to switch your camera on. It's a real pleasure to welcome you to this year's grid launch. I'd like to take this opportunity also to thank you and your colleagues at BHA for your global leadership on the issue of internal displacement, as well as your unwavering support to IDMC over the years. Our grid rests very much on the depth and the quality of our partnerships, and the one with USAID's BHA is certainly one of our most precious and appreciated. So I look forward to your remarks and hand over to you now. Thank you.
Thank you, Alexandra. It is really my pleasure to be here. Let me begin by expressing my thanks to IDMC for your annual global report on internal displacement. The message in the grid is loud and clear: climate and conflict. Violence, new and protracted conflicts, natural disasters, and the devastating impact of climate change continue to drive families from their home, and in many cases, multiple times. As IDMC lays out in this year's grid, forced displacement has yet again reached unprecedented levels. As I'm sure Alexandra will share in more detail, at the end of 2020, we now know that a record 55 million people around the world were living in internal displacement, 85% having fled violence and conflict. IDMC has been essential in reminding us not to look away. That 85% underscores the critical importance of dedicated diplomatic action to end conflict and facilitate humanitarian access and protection for civilians. From Yemen to Tigray to Syria, reaching those most in need and working to resolve conflict is a top priority for the US government. But it's also clear that it's not just conflict driving displacement, but of course disasters as well, and in particular the intersection of the two. Disasters triggered more than 3/4 of new displacements recorded worldwide in 2020. IDPs are already among the world's most vulnerable individuals. This year's report highlights how COVID-19 and climate impacts have served to only increase vulnerability and delay opportunities for durable solutions. I think it's well known that USAID is committed to providing life-saving, needs-based assistance to IDPs, including those newly displaced or those living in protracted displacement. We support organizations around the world to respond the moment a crisis hits and are indebted to the work of first responders who not only ensure quick action, but also sustain presence to support millions facing years, if not decades, of protracted displacement. Often communities, responders, and national and local governments are overwhelmed by the scale of displacement. And in many countries, the convergence of conflict and disaster not only exacerbates humanitarian need, but also forces many to be displaced multiple times due to a series of shocks. What may be less known is that for years, USAID has invested in disaster risk reduction programs that seek to prevent and reduce the impact of new and existing disaster risks. In order to save lives, reduce displacement, protect livelihoods and assets, and help communities adapt to climate change. That work has taken on more urgency and requires more focused attention. We know that the climate crisis has already placed a heavy burden on many displaced and host communities, as well as local governments. Climate change is a top priority of the Biden-Harris administration, and as such, USAID has started developing a comprehensive climate strategy, one that prioritizes active collaboration with women and girls, Indigenous people, youth, and other particularly vulnerable groups, including those internally displaced. Because climate change acts as a catalyst for disasters and displacement, we in USAID's Bureau of Humanitarian Assistance are working across the US government on a report looking at the links between climate change and migration, including forced migration, internal displacement, planned relocation, and most critically, looking at how the US government can better respond to these challenges. Data and analysis from IDMC is already informing these efforts. IDMC's work also helps us understand the impact of protracted displacement on individuals and particularly vulnerable groups, including access to basic and life-sustaining aid, as well as on livelihoods and longer-term solutions. As donors, responders, and governments, we need to be better at providing both immediate and longer-term solutions. This is why we view the ongoing work of the UN Secretary General's high-level panel on internal displacement as an important opportunity to not only evaluate and ensure accountability for how the humanitarian system is responding to IDP needs, but to also examine how we are working with affected communities, affected governments, and development partners to truly enable IDPs to pursue durable solutions. The panel has a real opportunity to galvanize action that would help affected countries reverse the trend of ever-increasing displacement. This is one of the many reasons why we value our partnership with IDMC, whose work is enabling us, the larger humanitarian community, to improve our response to internal displacement and prioritize scarce resources to reach the most vulnerable. The analysis and data provided by IDMC in the grid, severity analysis, and support to affected countries provides us the opportunity to harness our collective resources to support IDPs to not just meet their basic needs, but to pursue a future marked by well-being and dignity. I would like to end by thanking IDMC again for their excellent, if sobering, annual report. I'm pleased to hand the discussion back over to Alexandra to present the report's findings. Thank you again.
Thank you very much, Sarah, for these words, and thank you so much for your words of support to IDMC and to our work. I think you've highlighted very well the importance of partnerships and the importance for an international coalition of showing solidarity for this issue. So thank you very much, and we're very pleased also to see the US administration's engagement, not just on the issue of internal displacement, but also on climate action, which will be the topic of most of today's discussion. So thank you so much for joining us today. Ladies and gentlemen, 2020 was an exceptional year in many respects. We'll all remember it as the year in which the COVID-19 pandemic swept across the world, a year of movement restrictions and immobility for many of us. The pandemic has taken a heavy toll on the millions of vulnerable people and communities around the world, threatening their health, their livelihoods, their security, and their future well-being. And contrary to what might have been expected, it has not been met with less displacement. IDPs have been affected in more ways than one, and they're likely to feel its effects for the years and the decades to come. Lockdowns have prevented first responders from delivering basic humanitarian aid. They've stopped IDPs from returning home, suspended the pursuit of long-term solutions, and in some cases hampered primary data collection efforts. School closures have disrupted the education of IDP children, while their parents have been pushed deeper into poverty as a result of the loss of livelihoods. This has increased the risk of food and tenure insecurity and resulted in negative coping mechanisms and a greater exposure to violence and abuse. The pandemic has led us to recognize the importance of adaptability, flexibility, and locally led approaches. By adjusting our means of communication, our research methods, and the delivery of our own technical support COVID-19 has led us to innovate and to invest more than ever in the building and the deepening of local partnerships. This year's grid is the result of all these efforts. So it's my pleasure to share with you today the findings of the report, to take stock of the scale of the challenge that we're facing, and to look together to the opportunities ahead. We recorded 40.5 million new displacements in 2020. 40.5 million times that a woman, a man, or a child was forced to leave their home or their place of refuge. This is the highest figure in a decade and significantly higher than the average of 24.5 million over the last 10 years. In total, 9.8 million displacements were triggered by conflict and violence, which is an increase from 8.6 million in 2019. As you can see from this map, Sub-Saharan Africa and the Middle East and North Africa accounted for more than 90% of all new displacements by conflict and violence. In DRC, tensions between the Hema and the Lendu communities in the province of Ituri became increasingly violent and contributed to 640,000 of the 2.2 million new displacements that were recorded across the country. In Ethiopia, over 500,000 displacements were triggered by violence in the Tigray region, alongside, as you know, reports of human rights violations and abuses. In Africa, armed groups exploited simmering disputes and expanded their influence across the Sahel, as well as in Nigeria, Somalia, and Mozambique. The number of IDPs in Burkina Faso increased more than tenfold between 2018 and 2020 to over 1 million, making it one of the fastest growing displacement crises in the world. In Mozambique, the crisis in Cabo Delgado fueled more than 7 times the levels of displacement that we'd seen in 2019 and has left nearly 700,000 people internally displaced. Somalia, the Central African Republic, and Cameroon, who now host 1 million IDPs, also experienced significant new displacement as a result of conflict and violence last year. These situations are still all of great concern today. In the year that marked the 10th anniversary of the Arab Spring, internal displacement continued to have devastating impacts across the Middle East and North Africa, particularly in Libya, Syria, and Yemen. The government offensive in Idlib triggered nearly 1 million new displacements, which is the most significant single event since the start of the war. The West Bank also recorded its highest number of new displacements since 2016, largely due to a sharp increase in housing demolitions. And elsewhere, ongoing violence forced people to flee their homes, as in Myanmar or Colombia. Last year was one of the warmest years on record, which fueled intense storms and unprecedented wildfires across the globe. Disasters triggered 30.7 million displacements. As in previous years, the countries worst affected were China, the Philippines, Bangladesh, and India, all highly exposed to natural hazards and densely populated. Weather-related events, primarily floods and storms, were responsible for 98% of all disaster displacement. Nearly 70% took place in South Asia, East Asia, and the Pacific. Much of the displacement from intense tropical storms took the form of preemptive evacuations, which saved lives, but many people found their houses damaged or destroyed upon return, which prolonged their displacement. Cyclone Amphan triggered nearly 5 million evacuations across Bangladesh, India, Myanmar, and Bhutan last May. Vietnam bore the brunt of several typhoons coinciding with seasonal floods. And relative to its population size, Vanuatu was particularly hard hit by Cyclone Harold. Elsewhere, the Atlantic hurricane season was the most active on record, with 30 named storms. Hurricanes Laura, Eta, and Iota alone triggered 2.7 million new displacements across 14 countries. An unprecedented bushfire season in Australia destroyed over 3,000 homes, and 1.7 million new displacements were recorded in the US from devastating wildfires and hurricanes. An important reminder that high-income countries are just as exposed to disasters as low and middle-income countries are. The convergence of conflict and disasters led to many people becoming displaced for a third or fourth time. In Mozambique's Cabo Delgado province, violence escalated only a few months after the country had been hit by Cyclone Kenneth, which further aggravated food insecurity. So as we can see, 2020 came with exceptional levels of new displacements. So now let's turn to examine how many people were still living in displacement at the end of the year. The number of people worldwide living in internal displacement has reached a record 55 million. 48 million people are living displaced as a result of conflict and violence, and 7 million as a result of disasters. After 10 years of civil war, Syria continues to host the largest number of IDPs in the world, followed by the DRC, Colombia, Yemen, and Afghanistan. Countries with the largest number of people still living in displacement following disasters include Afghanistan, Ethiopia, India, Pakistan, and Sudan. Although the data here is still piecemeal, our coverage not yet comprehensive, and this estimate of 7 million IDPs considered a significant underestimate. What this data shows, nevertheless, is that from Central America to the Middle East, from Africa to the Pacific, rich and poor, male and female, old and young are experiencing internal displacement. With a global figure for conflict-related IDPs that has been steadily rising for more than a decade, these graphs reflect the persistent difficulty of ensuring sustainable returns and other durable solutions. Across the Middle East and North Africa, conflict resolution and peace building in the second half of the year, particularly in Iraq, Libya, and Syria, helped to reduce displacement in 2020. But the destruction of infrastructure, the interruption of essential services, and the lack of economic opportunities prevented many people from returning home and staying put. In the majority of cases, we can't be sure that IDPs are returning to adequate levels of safety and security, to a still standing home, and to services that will allow them to resume a normal life. In the absence of data on their situation, we fear that many are at risk today of becoming displaced again in the future. In the last 20 years, major climate-related disasters have doubled as greenhouse gas emissions have continued to rise. Combined with weak governance and environmental degradation, persistent inequality and marginalization are creating new risks and aggravating the impacts of the crises that we see today. This year's report focuses on displacement in a changing climate. We hope that this edition of the grid will contribute to global awareness and improved understanding of this phenomenon, and importantly, that it can provide a compelling evidence base for future policy making. Much of our efforts in collecting and analyzing data on disaster displacement since 2008 have served to counter various misconceptions surrounding this phenomenon and to build as nuanced and accurate a picture of it as possible. One of the most pervasive misconceptions is that disasters are natural and therefore inevitable, meaning that we can prepare for displacement but not prevent it. In reality, human behavior, such as unsustainable land use and the destruction of ecosystems, plays a major role. Another misconception is that disasters are short-term and that people return home quickly to rebuild and restore their lives. In many cases, however, displacement can last for months or years. This is obvious if we look at the 300,000 people who are still displaced today in Bangladesh 1 year today after Cyclone Amphan hit on the 20th of May, 2020. The role of climate change in triggering displacement also needs to be understood as one significant but not solitary factor. While rising temperatures are indeed increasing the frequency and the intensity of weather-related hazards, and slow onset environmental change can lead to displacement, a multitude of social and economic factors determine whether and how people are affected. What our evidence shows is that climate change will not necessarily lead to mass cross-border flows and migration to high-income countries. In reality, displacement triggered by the adverse effects of climate change has so far been fairly localized and concentrated within countries' borders. This has been corroborated by more recent studies, such as the World Bank's 2018 Groundswell report. Our understanding of how such impacts vary by age group, gender, and other characteristics is improving. We've seen that people with disabilities are particularly vulnerable to disaster displacement, that they find it harder to reach shelter or to access humanitarian assistance, and that they may be at higher risk of neglect, abuse, and violence. We also know that children are particularly at risk, as education is often the first casualty in times of hardship, and the reconstruction and recovery rate tends to be slower, of course, in the aftermath of a disaster. In 2020, 95% of the new conflict displacements that we recorded worldwide occurred in countries that are vulnerable to climate change impacts. In several countries, the convergence of conflict and disasters led to many people becoming displaced for a second or even third time. The Liptako-Gourma region between Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, for example, has suffered prolonged periods of drought in recent years. This has resulted in land and water scarcity, and it's fueled conflict between farmers and pastoralists. Extremist groups have exploited the situation and expanded their influence in all three countries. The violence that this has created is responsible for the nearly 1 million new displacements that we recorded in the region in 2020. In Yemen, more people were displaced by devastating floods and storms than by conflict in 2020. These led to over 200,000 new displacements and aggravated what was already the world's worst humanitarian crisis. Many of those who were uprooted by these extreme weather events had been previously displaced by conflict and were living in makeshift shelters and informal settlements, which made them more exposed and vulnerable to flooding. We can learn from many of the regional and national policies that have been successfully developed to address this issue, from Bangladesh to Peru. A growing number of countries now recognize disaster displacement and are beginning to invest in proactive measures, such as planned relocation and adaptive local initiatives to reduce displacement risk. At the global level, the recommendations of the Task Force on Disaster Displacement under the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, established in the follow-up negotiations to the Paris Agreement, and those of the Global Compact on Migration have far-reaching provisions on climate displacement, including prevention and durable solutions. The GCM in particular presents an important opportunity to consolidate ideas already brought forward but not yet clearly spelled out about the role of climate change in disaster displacement, and to close gaps in the Sendai Framework, the 2030 Agenda, and the Paris Agreement. A number of countries and actors are demanding that existing development finance and humanitarian budgets be made more flexible and responsive to displacement risk and crises. This means recognizing that preparedness planning and disaster management have to go beyond evacuation plans, and that local and national governments need to be equipped with the right technical and financial tools to anticipate and to prepare for the future, including for potential prolonged disaster displacement. Doing so would pave the way for more dedicated funding streams to emerge, such as local and national forecast-based financing tools or pooled multi-donor trust funds at the regional and even global level. There's growing consensus that more funding needs to be channeled into forward-looking approaches and more risk-informed investments. Filling the data gaps will be critical to support these efforts and to make the case for more flexible and predictable funding. This will require partnerships at all levels, and I'm proud that IDMC is partnering with leading climate scientists and demographic modelers to understand better what the future holds. The results of this new and innovative work show that the risk of disaster displacement is distributed globally, but that some regions are disproportionately affected. Asia bears the brunt of it, but relative to population size, displacement risk is also particularly high for small island states. Such risk assessments can be scaled down to subnational level and provide critical information to countries in support of preparedness and response for risk reduction and climate change adaptation. Including latest climate projections into our model, we can also see that flood-related displacement risk increases by more than 50% for each degree of global warming. They also show that unsustainable development in hazard-prone areas increases this risk by much more. This means that while climate action is critical, much can be done through accelerated investment in key sectors like resilient infrastructure, urban planning, education, and health. In essence, data and evidence will be the prism through which we will learn and succeed. With less than a decade left to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals, tuning our tools to better understand disaster displacement and the role of climate change will have to be a priority. We make concrete recommendations in the report regarding future priorities for data collection and monitoring, but also for more systematic learning and peer-to-peer exchange on this topic. On this note, I'm very pleased to be joined today by 3 speakers who will be sharing their insights and their practical experience of this issue from a national, a regional, and global perspective. So it's my pleasure now to introduce them all to you now. If I could ask the speakers to switch on their cameras. Monsieur le secrétaire général, pourrais-je vous demander d'allumer votre caméra, s'il vous plaît? Très bien. Let me start by welcoming Mr. Aly Diop, Secretary General of the Ministry of Health and Social Development of Mali, which is the ministry in charge of monitoring the situation of internal displacement and coordinating assistance to IDPs across the country. Monsieur le secrétaire général, je vous remercie infiniment d'avoir accepté notre invitation. C'est un immense plaisir pour moi de vous accueillir. Le ministre malien de la Santé et du Développement social joue un rôle primordial dans la réponse apportée à la question du déplacement interne. Et je me réjouis du partenariat que mon organisation IDMC a pu établir avec votre ministère pour améliorer la collecte et l'analyse des données sur ce phénomène qui, nous l'espérons, va permettre de soutenir des politiques et des stratégies intégrées et apporter des réponses durables aux personnes déplacées au Mali. Je reviens vers vous dans un instant.
OK, merci, madame.
Our second speaker today is Mr. Anare Leweniqila, Deputy Permanent Representative of the Republic of Fiji to the United Nations in Geneva and Chair of the Platform on Disaster Displacement. Mr. Leweniqila was formerly head of Fiji's National Disaster Management Office and has spent much of his career in the Fijian civil service working in the National Planning Office. Mr. Leweniqila, we're delighted to have you with us today and look forward to hearing how Fiji is responding to this issue, which we know has become more urgent than ever in your country. And finally, our third speaker today is Ms. Asako Okai, Assistant Administrator and Director of the Crisis Response Unit of the United Nations Development Programme, UNDP. Ms. Okai has over 30 years' experience serving in the Japanese Foreign Service and an extensive track record in development, humanitarian response, disaster management, and peace-building work, both at strategic and operational levels. Ms. Okai, we're delighted to welcome you today to share your perspective of what can and is already being done by our UN partners on this issue and what opportunities lie on the global policy horizon for making progress on it over the coming decade. I would like to turn first to Monsieur Diop. Monsieur le secrétaire général, je vous souhaite encore une fois la bienvenue à cet événement. Et j'aimerais commencer par une question qui s'adresse tout d'abord à vous. J'aimerais que vous nous expliquiez, à nos participants dans quelle mesure les catastrophes et le changement climatique affectent aujourd'hui les différentes communautés du Mali et ont pu notamment affecter ou aggraver des situations de déplacement interne qui existaient déjà liées au conflit et à la violence.
Merci, madame, de me donner l'opportunité de m'adresser à cette auguste assemblée au nom du ministère de la Santé et du Développement social, mais également au nom du Mali. C'est un honneur fait au Mali et nous vous en remercions infiniment. Excellence, Monsieur l'ambassadeur de la République du Mali auprès de la Confédération helvétique, représentant permanent du Mali auprès des organisations du système des Nations Unies à Genève, Madame Sarah Char, assistante de l'administratrice de l'USAID en charge du Bureau pour l'assistance humanitaire, Madame Alexandra Bilak, directrice de l'Observatoire sur le déplacement IDMC, Monsieur Anare Leweniqila, représentant permanent adjoint de la République de Fiji auprès des Nations Unies à Genève, Madame Asako Okai, sous-secrétaire générale, directrice du bureau des crises du programme des Nations Unies pour le développement, chers participants, mesdames et messieurs, permettez-moi tout d'abord d'exprimer toute ma gratitude à la représentation permanente du Mali à Genève d'avoir facilité la participation du Mali à la cérémonie de présentation du rapport 2020 sur les déplacés internes. Je voudrais également féliciter et remercier Madame la directrice de l'Observatoire sur le déplacement et tous ses collaborateurs pour les différents échanges que nous avions eus depuis quelque temps et le choix porté sur le Mali pour participer à cette 6e édition. La question que vous me posez pour parler de l'expérience du Mali, Madame Bilak, je voudrais tout simplement dire que le Mali est un vaste pays sahélien d'une superficie d'environ 1 241 000 km², situé entre les 10e et 25e parallèles de latitude nord et entre les 4 degrés de longitude est et 12 degrés de longitude ouest, avec une population estimée en 2020 à 20 933 000 habitants. Et c'est un pays de l'interland au cœur de l'Afrique de l'Ouest, entouré de plus de 7 pays limitrophes sur une distance de 7 km, 7000 km. À l'instar des autres pays du Sahel, le Mali a connu depuis des décennies plusieurs situations de mouvement de population dues, notamment, comme l'a dit un prédécesseur, à des sécheresses cycliques. Tout comme la plupart de ces pays en développement, il est particulièrement à risque en raison des bas revenus des populations également, de la faiblesse du capital humain et de la vulnérabilité économique de ces populations. Ces différents déplacements pourraient avoir plusieurs causes, notamment les effets des changements climatiques, à savoir les inondations, sécheresses, les vents forts, les fortes variations de température, les conflits intra- et intercommunautaires, la réalisation de grands travaux ou autres aménagements d'intérêt public ou national, à savoir les barrages, les infrastructures routières, etc., mais également, depuis un certain moment, la menace terroriste. Les déplacements internes dus au changement climatique constituent de nouveaux défis qui risquent de mettre en péril les résultats de plusieurs décennies d'efforts de lutte contre la pauvreté et le développement dans les différents secteurs socio-économiques du pays. Depuis quelques années, le nombre de nouveaux déplacés provoqués par les catastrophes a considérablement augmenté en rapport évidemment avec les changements climatiques qui ont un impact certain sur les déplacements internes au Mali. De par le mode de vie, les activités économiques de certaines populations du Mali sont liées aux changements saisonniers, notamment dans la zone office du Niger et dans le delta central du pays. Il s'agit des pêcheurs et des agriculteurs dont les activités dépendent de la situation climatique. Face à ce contexte, notre pays a adopté depuis 2011 une politique nationale de lutte contre les changements climatiques qui donne les fondements pour un cadre unique de référence pour la coordination et la mise en synergie des différentes interventions en matière de changement climatique ainsi que l'intégration des changements climatiques dans les différentes politiques sectorielles. Les conséquences des inondations en 2020 104 670 personnes sinistrées dans 13 816 ménages. Ces inondations ont touché 294 localités, causant malheureusement 28 décès. Les modèles de déplacement au Mali du fait des changements climatiques sont saisonniers. Toutefois, ils s'inscrivent de plus en plus dans la durée. C'est le cas dans la zone office du Niger, où l'envahissement des champs de culture par les eaux et les travaux d'irrigation ont provoqué le déplacement de plusieurs villages. Aussi, la crise institutionnelle et sécuritaire de 2012 a entraîné plus de 500 000 déplacements internes en 2013, mais avec le retour à la normalisation et les efforts des forces de défense et de sécurité, avec l'appui de la communauté internationale, le nombre de déplacés internes a été réduit à environ 35 000 personnes en 2017. Les conflits inter- et intracommunautaires, surtout dans le centre du pays, ont accentué la situation en entraînant en décembre 2020 environ 311 193 déplacements internes et 151 155 réfugiés dans les pays d'asile. Cette situation se trouve exacerbée par le phénomène cyclique des catastrophes naturelles telles que les inondations et les sécheresses, avec des conséquences dévastatrices sur les plans économiques, environnemental et social. Par rapport aux approches réussies ou prometteuses d'entreprises, le gouvernement de la République du Mali a toujours fait du changement climatique un axe important de sa politique environnementale à travers son engagement à combattre les changements climatiques en posant un certain nombre de jalons qui sont la signature en 1992 de la Convention cadre des Nations Unies sur les changements climatiques qui a été ratifiée le 28 décembre 1994, la signature du protocole de Kyoto en 1999 et sa ratification le 28 mars 2002, et enfin l'élaboration en 2007 du programme d'action national d'adaptation aux effets néfastes des changements climatiques. Il a également été adopté en 2011 une politique nationale sur les changements climatiques qui donne la vision et les orientations stratégiques. Une stratégie nationale de gestion des risques et catastrophes, un plan annuel de contingence multirisques et une politique humanitaire assortie d'un plan d'action sur la période 2018-2022. Depuis 2014, le gouvernement, avec l'appui des PDF humanitaires, a mis en place des mécanismes de suivi et d'évaluation des déplacements internes, dont la matrice de suivi des déplacements, DTM, la commission mouvement des populations, les CITREP, les évaluations sectorielles, les études de profilage. C'est le lieu de saluer le partenariat avec l'OIM et le HCR dans le cadre du suivi des mouvements des populations. Toutefois, il est important de noter que la situation des mouvements de population fait l'objet d'une communication hebdomadaire en Conseil des ministres, d'où l'importance que lui accorde donc le gouvernement de la République du Mali. Quant à la politique nationale sur les changements climatiques, elle s'articule autour de 8 orientations politiques. La mise en place d'une gouvernance anticipative, la promotion d'une intégration des changements climatiques dans les politiques et stratégies sectorielles, le renforcement des actions d'adaptation aux impacts des changements climatiques, la prévention et la gestion des risques et catastrophes naturelles, la promotion des actions d'atténuation des émissions de gaz à effet de serre, le renforcement de la recherche pour le développement, la vulgarisation et le transfert de technologies, et enfin la génération d'informations et de données appropriées. Septième point, l'information, la sensibilisation du public, la formation et le renforcement des capacités en matière de changement climatique, et enfin, huitième orientation, la promotion et le renforcement de la coopération internationale et sous-régionale. Les domaines prioritaires de cette politique sont le développement rural à travers l'agriculture, la gestion des ressources en eau et la préservation des forêts. Les infrastructures à travers les secteurs de l'énergie, des transports et de l'aménagement du territoire, le cadre de vie par l'amélioration de la santé des populations et l'assainissement de leur cadre de vie, l'industrie et les mines axées sur les impacts des industries et de l'exploitation minière sur l'environnement. Mesdames et messieurs les participants, je ne saurais terminer mon intervention sans féliciter et remercier tous les partenaires du système des Nations Unies, des organisations internationales, des partenaires techniques et financiers pour les différents efforts de soutien aux populations en détresse et aux actions du gouvernement sans cesse animées par les catastrophes et sécheresses qui s'abattent sur le pays. Je remercie également tous ceux qui ont contribué à la tenue de ce lancement et en particulier son Excellence, Monsieur l'ambassadeur Mamadou Henri Konaté et tous ses collaborateurs. J'ai une pensée pieuse pour toutes les personnes victimes de catastrophes et calamités naturelles de par le monde en raison justement de leur vulnérabilité. J'en appelle à la solidarité de la communauté internationale en général et aux partenaires humanitaires en particulier pour soutenir nos gouvernements dans cette lutte pour la préservation du droit et de la dignité humaine dans le cadre de la nécessaire résilience des populations face à ces différents chocs. Je peux vous rassurer de la disponibilité du ministère de la Santé et du Développement social à poursuivre une collaboration fructueuse et un partenariat avec l'Observatoire des déplacés. Je ne saurais terminer mon propos sans souhaiter une bonne exploitation du rapport mondial 2020 de l'Observatoire sur les déplacements internes. Je vous remercie de votre aimable écoute. Merci, Madame Bilak.
Merci infiniment, Monsieur le Secrétaire général, pour cette intervention très complète qui reflète également l'approche de votre gouvernement, qui est une approche, un modèle que nous souhaiterions d'ailleurs pouvoir répliquer dans d'autres pays, une approche très complète de prise en compte de la thématique du déplacement interne qui, comme vous l'avez noté, se manifeste non pas seulement dans un contexte d'insécurité et de conflit, mais également dans ce contexte de changement climatique. Une approche très complète qui prend en compte non seulement la nécessité de réduire le risque, d'anticiper les catastrophes futures, de fournir une assistance humanitaire aux sinistrés, aux personnes affectées, et de commencer déjà à envisager un développement plus durable à l'avenir. Donc, encore une fois, merci Monsieur le Secrétaire général. Je reviendrai sûrement vers vous tout à l'heure pour une deuxième petite intervention.
Okay,
merci, Monsieur. I would like to turn now to Mr. Leweniqila. We've just heard the experience of... Monsieur le Secrétaire général, serait-il possible d'éteindre votre micro? Voilà. I'd like to turn to Mr. Leweniqila. You've just heard, we've heard the concrete example of what Mali is experiencing right now. But Fiji and the Pacific region also have a long-standing experience of responding to disaster displacement in both sudden and slow onset contexts. Could you tell us what are some of the challenges that Fiji has been facing when it comes to ensuring the future survival, the protection, but also the governance of this response to displacement affected communities?
Thank you, Alexandra. Thank you for the opportunity for Fiji to be part of this involved event. And I take this time to congratulate IDMC on the launch of the report. Fiji, like many countries in the Pacific region, we can say that disaster is part of our way of life. And we can say the frequency and the intensity of events is a reality for our region in terms of the events that are occurring. I want to address the two issues using two narratives. One is understanding disaster displacement persons in the context of sudden onset events, and in terms of looking at slow onset events. One of the questions that we do not carefully examine is the proportion of the affected population that eventually becomes permanently displaced in any onset event. In many countries in the Pacific region, our disaster management governance arrangement are set out in our Disaster Management Act. Our current definition of displacement is framed around those people who normally seek shelters in evacuation centers and in other designated shelters. And that is where the focus of our intervention lies during the emergency period. But what happens outside the boundary of the early recovery period or the declared emergency period continues to be a challenge in terms of looking at protracted displaced persons. Right now, we do not have a specific institution that operates beyond the emergency period that is specifically tasked to look on protracted displaced persons. So on initial assessments, while we may have a picture of the affected population, the proportion that might be subject to protracted displacement cannot be easily determined. One of the attributes to this lack of determination is related to data. As we have mentioned earlier, we only respond during the emergency phase. So our data only captures information from evacuation centers and does not go beyond the emergency phase. Another reason for the lack of follow-up is grounded in our strong communal relations, which is a form of coping mechanisms after these devastating events. By staying with the relatives and extended family, they are no longer part of the statistics. And there is an underlying assumption that their life has returned to normal or their situation has improved. Thus, there is no need for any follow-up action. So understanding who is displaced varies from a rural to urban setting. While it is much quicker to gather information on rural or island communities, it's much more difficult in the urban context, especially with people living in informal settlements. A lot of our major flooding and damage from disaster events in Fiji and in the Pacific occurs in the urban areas. There is a tendency for people to fall into the poverty trap and may have gone unnoticed. So in terms of looking at these events, the tracing element is still a challenge in urban areas. While we have strong rural and village governance, the urban area is an area where we are trying to build stronger governance arrangements, to looking at how people in these informal settlements are looked after in terms of the aftermath of an event. And I would like to say that this is an area that we are trying to strengthen in the review of our current legislations. To look at it in the context of slow onset events. In the Pacific, the reality of experiencing a disaster event provides us with a baseline reference on understanding vulnerabilities. We get to see firsthand those impacted communities affected by flooding and storm surges, and those communities facing food and water security in the islands. So we understand that vulnerabilities can be assisted with technology. We can use technology to better understand vulnerabilities. But our biggest challenge lies in technology transfer. We often talk about systems and processes where you have people working on real-time digital maps and playing out different scenarios. The Pacific is a bit off the pace in that regard. If you have been to the Pacific, you will note that disaster operations is still very labor intensive. Reports from 10 years ago still remain to be digitized. So if you want information or to do research, you will have to dig through files or report to have this information. From the Fiji experience recently, with the assistance of the government of Australia, we have managed to install a digital system working with maps in real time to look at events and predicting affected population and what are some options for both immediate and long-term assistance. But we still lack capacity to work on modeling for future events, especially around climate change. So the lesson from the Fiji experience is that adequate capacity is built around having a system and vice versa. This is important for technology transfer because without this infrastructure, it will be very difficult to transfer new technology and build capacity in the Pacific region to monitor displacement. This is important when we're also looking at building stronger governance arrangement at the national level on displacement, which is built on solid policy advice that is grounded in the science. So I think based on the grid reports, I think this is a way it bridges that particular challenge and it provides good guidance and understanding of internal displacement in the region. But when we're also working on displacement COVID-19, now this has further complicated in terms of the degree in working with displaced persons, because you need to ensure safety of both frontline and affected population. The Pacific is a region that is very social. We are outgoing people, and social distancing is interpreted very differently in our culture, because social gathering is one of our greatest coping mechanisms. We greet people with a handshake, a hug, or a kiss on the cheek, and that is how we reciprocate. And it was also through these gestures that our frontline emergency responders can identify signs of psychosocial issues, gender-based violence, and also in terms of asking the hard questions relating to hardship and welfare, which are important drivers of displacement at the community level. So with social distancing, we are losing the human element to get vital responses, which we cannot get through an interview or filling out initial damage assessment forms. So for Fiji, in terms of the experience, we were lucky that we had a disaster operation on top of a pandemic containment operation. So we have managed to use the opportunity to look at our governance arrangement regarding disasters and health pandemics and how we can look at new elements to address displacement. Not only does it mean looking at new ways of doing things, but also in terms of challenges in terms of cost. We have to look at much bigger assets which can allow for social distancing, and also in terms of delaying our presence on the ground because the need for those health issues that need to be done for tracing purpose for COVID-19. So as we speak, we have a second wave, and we are learning by doing as we go along. And it is also helping us in terms of looking at the issue around displacement in both slow onset and rapid onset, and also in terms of working within new emergencies like COVID-19. Thank you, Alexandra.
Thank you very much, Anare, for these very concrete examples, not just of what disaster displacement already looks like in Fiji, but some of the challenges that you're facing and that you want to prioritize in the coming years. Let me just tell you the let's say 4 main things that I'm taking away from what you've just said. One is the confirmation of our findings of the reports that disaster displacement can become protracted, in some cases even permanent, something that Mr. Secretary General from the Ministry in Mali also referenced in relation to his own country, entire villages who are now facing a risk of uninhabitability and where the prospect of a relocation becomes all the more urgent. The second element that you've mentioned is the urban dimension of internal displacement and the challenges that come with responding in such contexts, with first identifying who is displaced in an urban center, and then responding with all the governance challenges that this involves. The third element, which I find very important as well, is the issue of data and technology, and what are some of the tools that local and national governments are going to need in order to better prepare and respond to this issue in the future. tools that may be available right now among their international partners, but that at some point will have to be handed over and transferred to them so that they can integrate it into their own strategies and policies in the future. And then, of course, the final point that I'm very glad that you've mentioned is the compounding effects now of COVID-19, what that has meant for responding and providing assistance to people in that immediate emergency phase. But what is it going to mean really for all of our working methods in the future when, as you say, Anare, we're losing the human element, and how we're going to be able to protect people over the long term when we're at the same time forced to socially distance and facing second, third, and hopefully not, but future waves. So thank you very much, Anare. I'm sure that many of those points will be taken up by our audience as well in the Q&A. I'd like to now hand over to Ms. Okai, to Asako, who, of course, is going to be looking at this perhaps more from a global perspective, but I'd be very interested to hear from you, Asako, what you see as key opportunities for advancing policy making on this topic. Where do you see it sitting right now in existing frameworks such as the SDGs, the Paris Agreement, the Sendai framework, and of course the GCM, the Global Compact on migration? Over to you.
Thank you, Alexandra. UNDP is very pleased to be invited at this launching event of the grid. As you have presented, the figures in the 2021 report is sobering. Really, it's the unprecedented number came out, and the combined effects of climate change and the COVID-19 pandemic will reverse decades of hard-won development gains. So the UN Secretary General recently noted in 2021, we need to move from death to health, from disasters to reconstruction, from despair to hope, from business as usual to transformation. And this is what we need to do. Much more need to be done. The world is adapting to increasingly extreme weather due to the climate emergency, and the recognition of climate and disaster-induced displacement in international frameworks is evolving. And there is a growing acknowledgement that mitigating risk of displacement need to be factored into frameworks for sustainable development, disaster risk reduction, and climate change, but also social protection and human rights protection. So the unanimously agreed 2030 agenda and the sustainable development goals recognize forcibly displaced people as a vulnerable group in need of particular attention and calls for the full respect for human rights and the humane treatment. Importantly, the 2030 agenda committed us to leave no one behind. IDPs, and particularly those in a situation of protracted displacement, are very much at risk of being those left farthest behind. The more recent inclusion of the specific SDGs indicator on the number of forcibly displaced population under the target 16.3 is a significant step forward, improving developmental data on forced displacement and collective accountability in addressing it. And as for the Sendai framework on disaster risk reduction, disaster-related displacement is recognized as both a significant consequence of disaster risk and, should it persist, a serious driver of future risk. The framework aims to reduce all forms of disaster risk, including the risk of disaster displacement. Achieving progress on the Sendai targets on risk reduction is therefore critical to efforts to prevent, reduce, and manage disaster and climate-induced displacement, as well as the associated secondary impact. With respect to the Paris Agreement, COP21 established a task force on displacement to develop recommendations for integrated approaches to avert, minimize, and address displacement related to the adverse impact of climate change. UNDP is part of this task force, and its main priorities are to increase knowledge and capacity on the nexus between climate change and human mobility, including through the development of training modules and capacity development support. We agree with the GRID report, that the Global Compact for Migration provides important opportunities to address climate and disaster-induced displacement. It is promoting safe, orderly, and regular migration, as well as approaches and mechanisms to address the vulnerability of persons affected by climate and disaster risks. The GCM enhances the coping capacity of this population, including through devising planned relocation opportunities as an adaptation measure. Across all these frameworks, we can see the increasing integration of displacement and evolution of our collective narrative. Within UNDP, we feel that the UN Secretary General's high-level panel in internal displacement represents an important opportunity to further evolve our narrative and approaches on addressing and reducing displacement, in particularly by looking at the importance of complementarity of the developmental solution to humanitarian approaches, and by making the link to disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation. We are pleased to see the movement of the panel in this direction, with a specific focus on political will, national ownership, and accountability, protection of rights, elevating prevention, as well as more effective collaboration between humanitarian development and peace actors. UNDP is advocating to the panel that its work can offer an important opportunity to reframe and reset our understanding of durable solutions as fundamentally a development issue. We are emphasizing a renewed focus on the role of states in being accountable for and to internally displaced populations, and in working with development partners to address the root causes of displacement in their development planning and prioritization. We in UNDP are supporting our program countries to better deliver on this in practice. I'm ready to provide many examples, perhaps in the next round, but I just would like to touch upon Somalia. In Somalia, the government's current National Development Plan 2020 to 2024, which is aligned to the SDGs, is based on a poverty analysis that shows that IDPs have the highest rates of multidimensional poverty in the country. The plan prioritizes development solutions for displaced communities across most of its pillars, including in the areas of security, justice, employment, and service delivery. UNDP's programmatic support in the country seeks to address the root causes of displacement, including multidimensional factors such as climate-induced disasters, instability, and conflict, through supporting climate change adaptation combined with resilience building and community-based disaster risk reduction, and investment in local governance, as well as efforts to build peace and reduce violent extremism. So to sum up in my first round of comments, as we are preparing for the COP26 in Glasgow later this year, GRID 2021 also reminds us about the importance of scaling up our collective ambitions, principally to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and reach adaptation goals in line with the 2015 Paris Agreement under the UNFCCC. UNDP has the Climate Promise Offer, which is to be provided at this time, currently supporting 118 countries on national development contributions, NDCs, to scale up their ambitions in implementing the 2015 Paris Agreement. Thank you. Over back to you, Alexandra.
Thank you very much, Asako. You've already started looking to some of the opportunities ahead. We've taken stock of the scale of the challenge, looking at two very concrete examples from Mali and Fiji. And as you mentioned, there are many opportunities on the policy horizon in particular to make collective progress on this issue. three key points that you've mentioned. One is the importance of evolving this collective narrative and this common understanding of the phenomenon itself, moving it beyond a humanitarian issue, but really and definitively positioning it, I would say, in a development conversation. You've talked about here the need to seek much more complementarity between development solutions and humanitarian programming. And I think that is very much the challenge that lies ahead, working on this nexus. And then I think at the center of this, the third element that you've brought up that is so important and really is at the heart of the deliberations of the high-level panel right now is really how to improve national accountability and really give the tools that are needed for states to take their responsibilities towards their citizens and integrate this issue into national priorities. I will now be turning back for a second, and I think it will have to be a slightly shorter round of questions, otherwise we won't have time for the Q&A. Coming back to Monsieur le Secrétaire général, je reviens vers vous pour une dernière petite question. Comme vous avez pu l'entendre, nous avons deux expériences très concrètes de votre pays et de celle des îles Fidji. Deux expériences qui se ressemblent à bien des égards, mais également beaucoup d'opportunités au niveau international avec les cadres normatifs et politiques existants. Donc des opportunités qu'il faut saisir et le besoin d'une approche collective et d'un renforcement des partenariats du niveau local jusqu'au niveau global. Je reviens vers vous pour vous demander s'il vous serait possible de partager peut-être une ou deux idées très concrètes qui, selon vous, et sur base de l'expérience de votre gouvernement, mériteraient d'être disséminées au niveau mondial, qui permettraient peut-être à d'autres pays d'apprendre des bonnes pratiques, mais aussi des erreurs peut-être qui ont été commises ces dernières années, dans un souci de partage d'expérience, d'apprentissage. Quelles sont pour vous une ou deux pratiques prometteuses ou initiatives que vous souhaiteriez diffuser au-delà du Mali?
Merci, Madame Bilak, de me redonner la parole. C'est vrai que, à bien des égards, il y a une similitude entre la vulnérabilité des petites îles et les pays de l'interland, comme je l'ai dit, du Sahel, qui subissent de plein fouet les sécheresses cycliques. Mais c'est pourquoi la réponse apportée par mon pays a été l'élaboration d'une politique nationale sensible au changement climatique. Cette politique nationale permet une interaction entre les différentes politiques sectorielles pour que chaque secteur de développement puisse prendre en compte ce plan, cette politique sensible au changement climatique. Donc, au-delà des engagements pris sur le plan international, nous avons adopté, comme je l'ai dit tantôt lors de ma première intervention, une politique nationale sur les changements climatiques qui crée une interaction entre les différents secteurs de développement. Donc, toute stratégie de développement sectoriel devrait prendre en compte justement les effets du changement climatique. Ça, c'est en tout cas une politique que nous avons adoptée. Et ensuite, une stratégie nationale de gestion des catastrophes et risques. Un plan annuel de contingence multirisque et une politique humanitaire sur la période 2018-2022 qu'on devait réactualiser d'un montant d'environ 3 milliards qui permet justement de répondre à cette, en tout cas, agression que constitue justement les effets du changement climatique, mais également, comme je l'ai dit tantôt, d'autres facteurs exogènes, la menace terroriste que nous subissons depuis un moment. Donc, cette politique humanitaire constitue une réponse de mon pays, en tout cas qui jusqu'à ce jour arrive à créer une certaine résilience par rapport justement à ces agressions. Voilà.
Je vous remercie.
Voilà, je ne sais pas si j'ai pu transmettre à vos préoccupations. Voilà.
Absolument.
Merci.
Absolument.
Madame.
Je vous remercie, Monsieur le Secrétaire général, et je suis très heureuse que vous ayez réitéré cette politique nationale, puisqu'elle reflète, comme nous venons de le dire, cette nécessité d'apporter une complémentarité entre une réponse humanitaire et des réponses de développement. Et dans l'idéal, cette interaction entre les différents secteurs et entre les différentes politiques sectorielles doit être inscrite dans une politique et une stratégie qui peut ensuite servir de feuille de route à tous les partenaires, au gouvernement, mais aussi à tous ses partenaires. Donc, encore une fois, un bon exemple ici d'une approche très complète pour un problème qui est lui aussi malheureusement très complet. Anare, I'm going to turn to you now just for a few final thoughts. You've already shared a lot about some of the challenges that you're facing, and Fiji has a lot of operational and policy experience when it comes to responding to disaster displacement, but also experience of planned relocation, of, as you said, data collection and analysis, and of course partnership building, not least through its co-chairmanship of the platform on disaster displacement. So could you say also in a few words what you see as some promising and positive rays of hope on the horizon, whether it's at the national, at the regional, or at the global level, that you may want to share here? Thank you.
Thank you, Alexandra. I think from my side, just briefly, in terms of looking at the work that we're doing, I think it's very important that we look at opportunity for informed, evidence-based policy making. I think that is very important in the work that we do now, not only in terms of looking at the things that we are facing in terms of the disaster, but also in the anticipation of the impacts of climate change. Because I think one of the most underlying factors right now around the issue of displacement is trying to address the issue of people being displaced. I think we try to minimize displacement, and that is something that we need to work on, especially in the Pacific, given our characteristics and our vulnerability. We are very small, fragile ecosystems, and that is something that we need to look at in terms of the plans or the options that we have in terms of looking. I know there's a project that is being currently piloted in the Pacific on understanding and enhancing this. And I think this is the findings from the project is very important in understanding displacement, our preparedness and our response, and also how governments can work in terms of looking at options and avenues for reducing displacement in the near future. Thank you.
Alexandra, you are on mute.
Apologies. You see, we're never completely safe from this technology. No, thank you very much, Anare, and for this important reminder of the need for evidence, but also the right kind of evidence at the right kind of spatial and temporal scale that can, again, help to also not just respond once displacement has happened, but also hope to prevent and minimize it in the future. Turning to you, Asako, for a final round. You mentioned at the end of your first round that you have a lot of examples to share. UNDP has really been at the forefront of course, working on the nexus, this nexus not just between humanitarian and development issues, but also between climate action, disaster risk reduction and development, and the nexus, of course, between conflict and disaster. So what do you see as good practices, promising approaches, either operational ones or policy ones, that you would like to see more of in the future and you would like to promote in this discussion?
Thank you, Alexandra, for the good question. We'll be happy to highlight many examples, but before doing so, let me highlight 4 key aspects of such comprehensive approach, and then I would go on as much as you allow me to go on. First, there will be 4 key aspects, I said. First, as a starting point, displacement, when it is, especially when it is protracted, it needs to be really treated as more as a development challenge. And then international displacement often results from failure of development in development practices that deplete the environment, or in the absence of social protection system, or in context of weak or absent local governance, rule of law, or security provision. So addressing these root causes requires investment in development pathways that are sustainable, green, and equitable, and that build inclusive and effective governance capacities, and that are capable of promoting social cohesion and building peace. This means governments needs to take ownership and leadership to ensure displacement population are well factored into development plans and budget, and the whole of the government approach is applied and involves all level of government, municipality level, local government, regional, entities, the private sector, civil society, and so forth, and across different lines of the service. And secondly, given how the COVID-19 pandemic exacerbated existing vulnerabilities, we need to better understand the multidimensionality of risk. And we need to ensure our development investment are more risk-informed, so that governments and people can address the issues with more comprehensive, joined up, and integrated effort on climate change adaptation, disaster risk reduction, and peace building. And third, we need a real and meaningful pivot to prevention and preventing forced displacement from happening in the first place. This means better data and analytics around risks and threat, and being able to translate these into concrete anticipatory and preventive actions. This includes helping countries to design risk-informed development plans and macroeconomic policies, as well as national adaptation plan. And fourthly, on partnerships. You also mentioned a partnership. Only by working together across sectoral silos and involving those at risk can we strengthen global ability to act ahead of climate extremes and disasters. As stated in the foreword of the report, to which UNDP contributed, addressing internal displacement requires more political will, more strategic financing, and better collaboration between stakeholders. I can provide some concrete examples on the ground addressing the above mentioned the 4 aspects, if you allow me. The report especially talks about the convergence of both conflict and disasters fueling compounded displacement crisis. And the international community is increasingly interested in understanding the impact of climate-related security risks. For instance, UN Security Council resolutions related to UN mission mandates have started to include climate security implications in the Lake Chad Basin, Mali, Somalia, Central Africa, and Darfur. With the development, an interagency initiative among UNDP and UN Department of Political and Peacebuilding Affairs and UN Environment called the Climate Security Mechanism was established in 2018 to strengthen the capacity of the UN to address the interlinkages between climate change, peace, and security. And now we serve 25 field initiatives. And UNDP's work on climate security focuses on making all conflict prevention and peace building work climate risk informed, as well as ensuring that climate mitigation and adaptation work is peace positive in ways that can go beyond do no harm. And let's take the Sahel as example. UNDP is working on a regional stabilization facility for the Lake Chad Basin and for the Liptap-Gogoma Authority to scale up the range of stabilization intervention, including security sector support. At the same time, UNDP has a strong climate adaptation portfolio there and is contributing to about displacement through investment in community assets and livelihood development. In Mali, for example, UNDP's adaptation project benefited over 200,000 community members by developing local livelihood systems such as agriculture, fishery, and livestock, harnessing partnerships with local authorities and community organizations. In Chad, we have a similar initiative, closely working with Lake Chad Basin Commission, which also coordinates the large security initiative in the basin. To Liptap-Gogoma Authority, a climate and security risk expert was posted and providing support to assess the development response strategy to climate-related security risks. And then we have a similar kind of the combined efforts to link up climate and the security issues and also displacement. We have the community resilience program in Cabo Delgado, Mozambique as well. And then there are many examples that I can give. I just would like to give one example involving the use of foresight and artificial intelligence. You talked about data analysis and technology. We are currently implementing the inception period for a new 4-year human mobility project in Asia Pacific on anticipatory policy options for disaster displacement and a future programmatic offer. The project seeks to strengthen the inclusion and resilience of migrants, displaced people, and host communities in informal urban settlement across 4 dimensions of livelihoods, participatory urban planning and development, social cohesion, and climate change adaptation. Focusing initially on Metro Manila in the Philippines and Ho Chi Minh City in Vietnam and Karachi in Pakistan, it follows 3-step methodologies with a strong research, analytical, and social media component that would inform a series of sub-national consultations that develop and choose pilot interventions addressing select challenges within the 4 dimensions mentioned. Analytic component involves efforts to comprehensively map informal urban settlement through AI-based tool chain applied to high-resolution satellite imagery. I'm going a bit too long, but I would just like to conclude by going back to my 4th point on partnerships combined with political will and financing. I would like to refer to the risk-informed early action partnership called REAP, which was launched at the UN Climate Action Summit in September 2019. That brings together an unprecedented range of stakeholders across the climate, humanitarian, and development communities with the aim of making 1 billion people safer from disasters by 2025. Despite the mounting impact of climate change, 1 in 3 people are still not adequately covered by early warning systems and early and anticipatory approaches. So REAP set out 4 ambitious targets around laws, policies, and plans, financing, risk management systems, and public awareness campaigns to target early action to reach last mile communities. At this moment, this initiative does not explicitly address displacement, but there is a space for partners and aligned organizations to drive a systematic shift toward acting early to reduce the impact of disasters and mobilize commitments and inspire action, including reducing the drivers of climate and disaster risks, which can lead to displacement. So the ambitious targets are achievable only through partnerships and shared commitment to joined up risk-informed preventive early action. Thank you. Over back to you, Alexandra.
Thank you, Asako, and great last point there. I'm sure there'll be a lot of interest in some of these initiatives and projects that you've mentioned. So probably expect either some questions or some emails that will come to you in the coming days. We have now reached, we're at the last half hour of this event, and I'd like to open up now this discussion after thanking all our three panelists for these excellent contributions to the discussion. I know there's a lot of interest from the audience to ask questions and provide insights, and I already have a list of people waiting to speak to all of you. And if I have understood correctly, I'm going to start with my friend Ambassador Andisha, the permanent representative of Afghanistan to the UN here in Geneva, who'd like to say a few words. Hello, Nasia, good to see you.
Yes, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. I just wanted to begin by thanking you and all your colleagues and everyone involved in this preparing this report. I understand it comes in a very critical juncture. Probably it was much difficult to collect the data than in the past, but I can assure you that the value of the data, the value of the analysis is also more than the normal time, and that's something that the previous speakers also made reference to in their interventions. I don't want to dwell on all the details which very nicely were put forward from the speakers in different parts of the world. I understand that the focus is mostly on the climate, but I wanted to tell you that certainly this report will highly contribute to our understanding of the situation of the IDPs on the ground. Not only it will help us, but also our understanding, but also it will help us, in terms of all the policies that we are taking on the ground. About Afghanistan, the numbers are speaking, for themselves. We see that shift between the disaster displacement, the climate displacement to some extent, but also conflict displacement. So these numbers are very dynamic, fluid, changing from time to time. But in 2020, the vulnerabilities of the IDPs were further exacerbated by this question of COVID-19 and the lack of access, the lack of to services, but also a lack of access to very rudimentary jobs that the IDPs could get at the vicinity of the major cities. I think that has further exacerbated. And even a report recently came by a research organization in Afghanistan that the sexual exploitation of IDP children or something of a concern, which came up recently. So I think this will certainly help us in stronger preventions in different parts of the world where is a prevention focus. In terms of the humanitarian responses, I think again it's very handy in terms of helping us better focus our humanitarian response. In terms of the solutions, I think this is one area that we work together, maybe a number of people also in this in the audience on the high-level panel. And one of the major parts and one of the major focus that we all have in the high-level panel is effective solutions and enduring solutions and finding new and innovative ways. And I think this will certainly help the panel. I know the panel is making their recommendations, but the numbers and the analysis which comes with this report will give them some more ideas. Of course, it's not new since the report has come. It has added to visibility of these people which normally were invisible in the past. I think this is a great contribution. And again, looking at the data and the trends, certainly it tells us about the new narratives about the IDPs. I think we need to look into this category of people with a with different lens, and I think again this is what the panel is planning to do. Certainly it's in areas it's protracted, but again in some areas, the IDPs are moving and shifting, but the camps and the places will remain. So maybe you would not have the same people. The people are moving, from one situation to others. From the IDPs, they will become refugees or migrants, or vice versa. But the areas where they're concentrating, they remain the same. And that tells us both about the protractedness of this, and also its connection to the disaster and to the changes, again, in climate, but also in our places in terms of the conflict, that have long-term impact or long-term effect on people's movement. So I think it's an eye-opener, and certainly with the added emphasis this year on the climate, I think it's a welcome report, and we will all work together with you and all with other organizations to adopt and to adjust our policies based on this data. So with this, I thank you very much, and I thank all the presenters who presented today, and it was very helpful, and we learned a lot from different parts of the world. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Andisha, for these encouraging words. I would also like to give the floor to Ambassador Antas, a permanent representative of Vanuatu here in Geneva. Ambassador, are you with us? Yes. Good afternoon.
Thank you. Good afternoon, and I want to thank you and congratulate you for the launching of the report, which is very useful. And I would like to thank you, Alexandria, Asako from UNDP, Anare, our TPR from Fiji, as well as our Secretary General of the Ministry of Health and Social Development in Mali. The panel members have provided very, very useful information, and I'm very happy to be part of the audience listening to the presentations. I would like to first start by saying that disaster-induced displacement and issues related to climate change are real issues. And the presentation by Anare from Fiji obviously covers a lot of what we are experiencing also in Vanuatu. It is also important for me to say that throughout our history, throughout Vanuatu's history, there had been this history of displacements happening, which had happened, and communities have reacted to that even before good governments were in place. Before that, communities have reacted to these displacements in different ways. In the case of Vanuatu, I will say this very quickly, that Vanuatu has 81 islands. At the moment, our population is around about 286,000. There are 112 languages. So when you have 81 islands, 112 languages, that means the cultures are very, very different. So when there is displacement, people are moving from communities are moving from one area to another, from one island to another, from the same island, but from village to another village. There is, of course, a challenge as to how do we help, how do we ensure that people who are being displaced are looked after and are cared for, and people as a community have a responsibility to take them into their embrace, into the community living. So having said that about our language and our culture, sometimes this, when it does happen, you can see that populations the receiving communities look after them very well. But it seems to me over a period of time, there could be instances of conflict because of land or because of anything that there might be a conflict between displaced communities and those who are receiving them in their villages or in the islands. So we have seen this very quickly in the case of Vanuatu, when a whole island had to be moved to another island because of a volcano eruption in this island. And people from another island took them in. Some other islands took part of the community. And we could see very quickly that in one part of the islands, they were not very welcoming. Initially, they were welcoming, but then they put in restrictions on them. So the cultural impacts are very important to understand that as well. Also, secondly, I wish to say this, that despite all these, like the COP21, the climate change displacement initiatives, it is also useful to consider that governments must invest in areas where displacements are occurring. Invest to ensure that facilities for education, for health services, for roads, for governance, to look after men and women and children and widows and those who have disability are looked after. So I think the issues regarding collection of data about these people should be something that should be addressed. And we in Vanuatu are also dealing with that. We're working very hard to try and manage that. I just want to make one comment which Fiji mentioned about the urban and the rural aspects of displacement. The phenomenon of urban migration is very real. And it's whatever happens, even though the government is investing in rural areas, we keep seeing this movement happening. And it creates its own problems. And as he has said, whether people are moving into the urban areas, whether they are being looked after, or are they being displaced, but nobody's talking about that. So I wanted to support those comments already mentioned. Thank you. Thank you, Alexandra.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Antas, for these words and for reminding us all, of course, of the importance of also taking into account the pressure that internal displacement can also put on host communities, and the need to therefore include them in any sectoral, operational, and policy plans. I would now like to give the floor to Mr. Daniel Tenker from the Permanent Mission of Ethiopia here. Daniel, are you with us? Yes.
Yeah. Can you hear me? Thank you so much. Thank you, the panelists, for sharing their experiences and views when it comes to IDPs. And thank you, Alexander. I would like to to congratulate you and your colleagues for launching GREAT. I know my country, Ethiopia, has been experiencing large scale of internal displacement over the past years, in particular owing to intercommunal conflicts and natural disasters. Responding to large scale of internal displacement presented enormous challenge. It also revealed important normative, institutional, and coordination mechanism gaps that required quick actions from the government and partners. However, the government focus on early solution helped to return and reintegrate millions of IDPs relatively in short time. IDMC's report, which is launched today, focuses on disaster, displacement, and the impacts of climate change, which is a cause for large-scale displacement in my country. We believe this GREAT report is very timely and informative. I hope it will shape the misconceptions on the impact of climate and disaster-induced displacement. Despite the fact that IDPs vastly outnumber refugees, the plight of internally displaced people is still largely neglected. IDMS played a significant role in bringing the issue of IDPs to the attention of the decision makers and stakeholders by providing credible data and analysis. My country commends the work of IDMC and highly values its partnership with IDMC. Finally, I wanted to raise some of the challenges in data collection and analysis, which is highly politicized when it comes to forced displacement. We feel that there is difficulty in identifying the size of populations that have gone through multiple rounds of displacement, and on standardizations of the methodologies or approach on which the data is collected leads to discrepancies in the data. It's not uncommon to see discrepancy in the collected data between the government and other stakeholders. Therefore, it would be good to establish a strong data management system which is shared between governments, non-government actors, and private actors. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Daniel, and thank you very much for this last point that you make regarding the difficulties of estimating the size of IDP populations in different countries and in different contexts, and the suggestion for the need for stronger national data management systems that can be developed as a partnership between governments and civil society and the private sector. On this note, I would like to hand over to Mr. Giovanni Cassani, who's joining us today, representing the Secretariat of the High-Level Panel on Internal Displacement, and who'd also like to say a few words. Over to you, Giovanni.
Thank you so much, Alexandra, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all the participants. I'll be delivering a statement on behalf of George Okonobo, who's the head of the Secretariat of the High-Level Panel, who unfortunately could not be present today because of a conflicting engagement. The panel welcomes the GREED report and its fresh set of data. This information included in the GREED are extremely important and valuable for the panel. In particular, the panel values the socio-economic impact data, and as crucial as the question of social or the cost of displacement is, the evidence and the conclusions remain quite limited. The financial value of humanitarian responses is often equated to the financial cost of displacement. We feel that the cost is likely to be higher. Any additional research and information on this going forward would obviously be extremely welcomed. The GREED focused on disaster and climate change proved very useful for the panel, even if the breadth and depth of the analysis we understand varies. The new data covered in the GREED should open and bolster the landscape of the panel's work. The data might also demystify the perception of a discourse on displacement mainly articulated around conflict and violence. Yet, disaster and climate-based triggers were responsible for the vast majority of displacement in 2020. And we know that not all displacement in 2020 remained displaced. There was a net increase of 2.8 million in the figure of the global displacement in 2020 compared to 2019. The GREED of 2021 reinforces the reality that the footprint of displacement today and in the future is linked and related to natural disasters and climate change, something that the strategic, normative, policy, institutional, and operational responses must take into account going forward. It's important also that this and future GREED improve the understanding of this truth linked of displacement, of the higher cost of displacement linked to disasters. The only projection available on the scale of disaster displacement is the one that we have from the World Bank. It's now 4 years old, and it says that by 2050, disaster and weather shock will have displaced 143 million people. This figure is widely used, but it's not uniformly bought into. Any additional analysis on this would be very helpful. The Secretariat supports the agreed key messages, and the panel would like to draw out overarching messages similar to the key messages to encapsulate its work. We're not in a position to tell those messages right now, but you will hear about them soon enough when the report will be published in September. And should the panel choose to draw inspiration from elsewhere, the GRID report would definitely be a very good place to start. GRID 2021 made very broad, encompassing and precious information available for all of us to access and act upon. The panel will definitely take advantage of this information. Congratulations to IDMC for its crucial work and the publication of this report. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Giovanni, and we do look forward to perhaps dedicating a more in-depth session with the Secretariat to the findings of this grid and looking together at how we can take over some of these messages into the final high-level panel's report. Thank you very much for joining us today. I'm very pleased to see and to hand over to Sumbul Rizvi, who's a special advisor on internal displacement and UNHCR, and also a member of IDMC's advisory group. Over to you, Sumbul.
Thank you very much, Alexandra. Of course, UNHCR welcomes the special focus and timely focus on disaster displacement and impacts of climate change. This is not only an underlying driver of displacement, but it is also shown to amplify existing tensions or conflicts and displacement in complex emergencies, which in turn, of course, increases existing vulnerabilities, gives rise to new ones, and poses obstacles for achieving lasting solutions for IDPs, refugees, and their communities. Now, work is, of course, ongoing between UNHCR and IDMC on data complementarities. I have two questions. One is, could it be possible to elaborate on approaches being taken for closer analysis of overlaps between disaster and conflict-induced IDP situations? This will facilitate a closer understanding of linkages, not only for causes, but also for solutions, especially in protracted contexts. And the second question is, are there examples of a time series analysis to understand the impact of disasters and climate change on displacement? And a last comment, really, the panelists, and really congratulations to all of you, have encompassed the wide range of concerns and acknowledged the need for data and evidence in displacement situations caused by climate change. The two country examples and the example provided by UNDP demonstrate the importance of enhanced national ownership of IDP data, which has the potential to influence decision-making, policies, and actions taken at the local, national, and regional levels, because these situations are cross-regional as well. And it will also ensure capacity building of national statistical organizations to embrace IDPs as a part of their regular data collection. Thank you very much, and congratulations once again, Alexandra, and to all of you.
Thank you very much, Sumbul. And I won't dare to give a comprehensive answer to two of your questions, because it would take too long, but perhaps suffice to say that in our report, we do make a lot of recommendations regarding the need for additional research into this phenomenon, given how limited the data is in certain contexts. And even though we do know, and we have statistics available on the number of people in certain contexts who become displaced as a result of a very close interconnection between environmental and conflict-related drivers, we certainly don't have information at a global scale. And what we are lacking right now is more qualitative analysis of what that actually means, how it translates into specific types of vulnerabilities, specific types of protection needs, and how those needs and vulnerabilities may evolve over time. So we have already invested in certain case study research, particularly in the Horn of Africa, looking into, for example, local integration opportunities for drought-related IDPs. But it's certainly not sufficient, and we welcome far more investments and partnerships in that respect. And the same thing applies to your question on time series analysis. The data there as well is still insufficient. Most of the data that we have on people who become displaced as a result of sudden onset disasters stops after a few number of days or weeks, and in the best case scenario, 2 or 3 months following a disaster. But we often don't have time series data that extends beyond that period. And that is a huge blind spot for us at IDMC, but also I believe for our government and international partners. So thank you for that question, but I'm sure we can discuss it in more detail offline. I would now like to hand over to Iben Willumsen from the EU delegation here in Geneva, who also would like to make a short intervention. Over to you, Iben.
Thank you very much, Alexandra, and thank you to all the distinguished panelists today. I think this has been a very interesting discussion and presentations, and we are very pleased to see the additional focus this year on internal displacement in a changing climate. A very timely focus. Please allow me to ask 2 questions, specifically to Alexandra and IDMC first, also on the data and how it's been developing, because as we know, there can often be many significant challenges to gathering data, and I would like to just ask, what have been your experiences, the most significant challenges this year, and also have you seen any progress to overcome these challenges and improving the soundness of the data? And it relates a little bit to the previous question that you just answered as well, but it could be on the overall numbers of IDPs, slow onset disasters, measuring the protracted nature of displacement, and also the cyclical displacement that you have also touched upon earlier. And then my second question would be on also relation to the high-level panel on internal displacement. Here I would like to ask both you from IDMC side, but also the panelists, which would be your key recommendations on IDP data gathering and processing that you believe that the high-level panel should take up, potentially both in relation to disaster displacement, but also conflict displacement. So with this, I thank you very much and look forward to hearing your responses.
Thank you very much, Iben, and for your interest as well in the data side of our work. We document every year the methodological caveats behind the estimates, which also includes a very thorough investigation into some of the methodological challenges that we face when we're verifying the information, when we're triangulating it, but also that our data providers themselves face when they're collecting that data on the ground. So there's a huge list of challenges, and perhaps to cite the most significant, as you said, I would say that it is very much about distinguishing who is becoming displaced repeatedly year in, year out, and who remains displaced at the end of the year. And for those who do remain displaced at the end of the year, how long does that displacement actually go on for? As I said, I would say that is our biggest gap right now, because this is typically where investments trail off after a certain time as a result of a huge number of factors, some of them being operational, some of them being financial, and some of them, of course, being political. But that still remains to this day a major gap when it comes to compiling those figures and then aggregating them at the global level. And then I would say, as I responded to Sumbul, the lack of sufficient qualitative information that again would require huge investments in long-term longitudinal research programs and studies to really understand how the needs of IDPs are evolving over time, how they're interacting with other contextual factors, structural issues that the countries and the communities that they live with are facing. And that sort of information is the only kind of information that will be able to inform much more targeted and effective responses. When it comes to the key recommendations on IDP data, again, I don't want to spend too much time talking about that, but I'll be happy to share with you the submission that IDMC made to the high-level panel, which focuses mostly on what we believe should be the next steps and the next priorities when it comes to national and global progress on IDP data collection. And the key recommendation, I would say, echoes a little bit what my colleague Daniel from the Permanent Mission of Ethiopia was saying, which is very much to build on the momentum that we're seeing right now and the willingness of certain governments across the world to do more when it comes to monitoring internal displacement and to embed this issue into multi-sectoral policies and plans, which means that with that should come national data management systems that can then support those plans and those policies. And those data systems have to be thought of and even conceptualized from the beginning as a partnership between a government and its civil society partners on the ground, and of course its international partners. And I think there again, the example of Mali is a very good one, where the government of Mali and Mr. Secretary General was explaining that the Ministry of Health and Social Development of Mali works hand in hand with IOM and UNHCR and has in fact taken over or inherited, I would say IOM has transferred its DTM methodology to the government, and the government is now using that tool and using the evidence and the data that comes out of the system to inform its national policy and planning, which I think is a very good example that could potentially be replicated elsewhere. On that note, I'm just going to do something really naughty and get someone to skip the queue here. It's Nunes from IOM's DTM who's asked for the floor. And since I've just mentioned DTM in Mali, Nuno, over to you, and good to have you with us. Nuno, are you there?
I am Alexandra, and I promise to be very fast. Just wanted to congratulate you, IDMC, the excellent panelists, for the session of today. Every year we look anxiously for the date that when IDMC publishes this report, because we need it. And just to highlight, as you said, that from the DTM side, or IOM side, we like to anchor the data that we produce in three key things. One is provision of assistance to people. The other one is supporting OCHA on the planning exercises, but then it's IDMC with the global estimates that also in using that, among other sources, puts our work in a global perspective, which we very much appreciate. It also every year gives us an indication of key areas for us to concentrate and look on after. And so thank you very much. Congratulations.
Thank you, Nuno. Thank you. I'd like to take the last, if you don't mind, that we extend into the next, let's say, 10 minutes, if that's okay, because I would like to give the floor to two of our key partners. The first being Mr. Georg Siep, who's representing the Permanent Mission of Germany here in Geneva. So very nice to see you and to have you with us. And over to you, Georg.
Thank you,
I hope I
Alexandra.
presented your name properly.
Yes,
my German is rusty.
very, very well pronounced. Thank you, Alexandra, and thank you for the very comprehensive report that, if I may say, has already found broad media reception in Germany. You may have seen some of the reports that have gone out there, among others in the Spiegel. The numbers presented in this report, and especially the unprecedented rise in the internal displacement, is certainly alarming. And we are working in a number of ways to address the issues of internal displacement, whether it's due to conflict or due to disasters. The data, in our opinion, show a need for more investment in disaster risk reduction and the scale-up of anticipatory humanitarian action programs. And our experience with these programs clearly show their value and the impact they have on preventing and mitigating displacement. Second, the data shows that we urgently need to step up the national and international approach to internal displacement, which is why we're accompanying closely the work of the UN high-level panel on internally displacement that has been mentioned a number of times, and which we are grateful that you are an advisor to, Alexandra. And we are hoping for some decisive and innovative and forceful recommendations from this panel. So very much looking forward to further discussions with the panel and to the report that is supposed to come out soon. So just to conclude, we very much appreciate IDMC's work, and we congratulate you on the granularity of the data and the work you're doing to continue to improve the data gathering and analysis, and we will continue to support your work in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Georg, and a huge thank you to you and your government for your dedicated and very generous support to IDMC over the years, without which we wouldn't have been able to produce this grid. I think it's important to say that. And on that note, I would like to hand over to our last speaker, who's Catherine Gill, who's representing the government of Australia and who's also been a very, very faithful, loyal partner to IDMC over the years, not least in your support of our work in the early years, from the beginning almost, when we started monitoring internal displacement in the context of disasters and climate change. So I think if there's one partner that I can mention whose role was critical in ensuring the birth of this grid 2020, it's certainly Australia. So great to have you with us, Catherine, and over to you for the final remarks.
Well, thank you, Alexandra, and congratulations to IDMC and all of your partners involved in producing GRID. We really strongly believe it's instrumental in growing our understanding of the causes and nature of internal displacement. And as you've highlighted, and we've heard from our panelists today, we're consistently seeing that the Asia Pacific is having the highest levels of disaster displacement, including the bushfires you mentioned in Australia. And I was interested in comments about the hidden side of prolonged displacement from disasters. And, you know, as you say, it also affects rich countries, and we still have people that are displaced from the bushfires of over a year ago. We panelists from our region have also highlighted that disaster risk reduction is critical in reducing displacement, and Australia is really pleased we're able to host our regional partners at the Asia Pacific Ministerial Conference on DRR in 2022. Thanks also for highlighting, both in your presentation and in the GRID report, the particular challenges for people with disability. And this is something, you know, we're keenly interested in. And we really appreciated seeing some of the emerging good practices. You highlighted still the gaps in disaggregated data. And I know we're very short on time, but just to flag our interest in sort of hearing about the opportunities you see to improve the quality of disaggregated data over time. So thanks again, and congratulations to everybody.
Thank you very much, Catherine, and thank you so much for joining us and for your kind words. I'm afraid we're going to have to close this event. We've already gone over time. For all those of you who had questions to ask or whose questions were not fully answered during this session, please feel free to reach out to us, and we will certainly come back to you with some more detailed answers. I just want to sum up very, very briefly in the few seconds that I have left some of the key takeaways of this discussion. I think we all agree that we need a new collective narrative, a new understanding of the issue of internal displacement that takes into account the clear, definitive development dimension of this phenomenon, and that also now takes into account all the compounding factors that we're seeing. It's not just a combination of conflict and disasters that is causing internal displacement, but a whole array of structural issues, not least now also public health ones, that are complicating the response on the ground and that are likely to add to the socioeconomic vulnerabilities that we're already seeing of IDPs today. This then brings us to a second key point, which is the fundamental and critical role that national governments have to play in finding solutions, and the need for all of us as an international collective to support national ownership and leadership on this issue. I'm personally very encouraged to see that this is very much the driving force behind the high-level panel discussions, and I very much hope, as someone said, I think it was Georg, that we get some transformative recommendations coming out of this panel process that will of course be built on this idea of a whole of government and a whole of society approach, including also taking into account the impact that this has on host communities, the multi-sectoral nature of the policies and the normative frameworks that are going to have to be put in place, building on the existing experience of countries like Mali and Fiji. And of course, the inclusion of a multidisciplinary set of partnerships to support these governments with civil society, but also the private sector. A third important takeaway is the importance of data and tools that have to be put at the disposal of local and national governments, strong data management systems that can allow governments not just to respond and target assistance where it's most needed, but also to anticipate future risks and future threats. And that, of course, will take a huge global effort, not just in collecting better data, but also in developing new technology that can be, as Anare was saying, transferred to local actors. And then finally, something that Asako mentioned repeatedly in your speaking points, but also that Mr. Secretary General in Mali said, is really very much the importance of partnerships and the need to seize the political momentum that we see today and the policy frameworks and opportunities that are already out there. So IDMC stands ready to support. We're committed to making progress on this issue, to advancing solutions on internal displacement, and to working with all of our partners, government, UN, civil society, and private sector over the coming years and decades. I would like to thank all of our speakers today, Ms. Sarah Charles, Ms. Asako Okai, Mr. Aly Diop, and Mr. Anare Leweniqila. It was a pleasure to have you all with us today, and thank you very much for connecting from different parts of the world and different time zones. It probably hasn't been the most straightforward, but I thank you for bearing with us. I'd like to thank all our partners for having made this grid possible, all our participants today, and of course, thank you to my brilliant team for working on this report and for organizing today's event. I wish you all a good rest of the day and look forward to staying in touch. Thank you.